For our market overview, obviously last week we weren't expecting too much, right? We understood that Thursday was a half day. We had Friday off for the 4th of July. Um, Now, obviously, we still had European markets and Asian markets trading because they don't celebrate the independence of America, right? Which makes sense. But with that being said, we saw some kind of interesting things last week that I want to highlight before we go forward. If people remember from last week's market overview, I put a box on it this time, labeled it lower time frame buying structure needs retest for confirmation. A lot of my language was kind of building this out, right? So, for example, like for last class, we didn't have this information yet, right? This is kind of where we were. So we had pretty poor node structure here, but still really thin all the way down through here. And we talked about specifically this node where we have confirmation of volume, right, but not time. So we don't know. Is this value? Is this not? Right? Now, for this week, a lot of that still stays the same. Why? Well, because our Thursday and Friday, did we look up and put new all-time highs? Yep. Was there much volume or time spent? No. Right? Especially without having New York session. Very, very muted. So, for this week, this area still major for me. Now, today was pretty impactful, and you saw of my midday the intraday ideas, and we talked about that as well, kind of in the middle of the day, where this look into last week's POC is pretty important and was pretty telling for the day. We'll take a look as we progress through class at more of our intraday structure, specifically this low. But so far test, we have confirmed values moving up, or on the flip side that sellers are not super eager down here to push away instantly, right, and get us down. So be watching this 45 last week's POC, obviously extended balance here, and really want to highlight this. Now, with all of that being said, we'll look at the bullish, then we'll go to the bearish, kind of pathing ideas. And then I think the highest probability for this week is going to be a neutral market, and we'll kind of talk about our two. We have a bullish leaning and a bearish leaning kind of neutral market setups, and that's what I'm more inclined and biased to expect for this week. And what I'll be looking for. So, for bulls, right, we can see I started the pathing down here. Why? Well, this last week's POC test and acceptance is your most bullish point, right? We saw that happen today. Can we still see continued tests? Of course, right? But this hold is your most bullish spot. We want to see RTH come through and clean all of this Thursday, Friday action from the European and Asian markets and put some more volume, spend some more time, right? Establish where actually is the participants positioned. Okay, we saw it today, right? Pretty big block of sellers up during our open kind of area and down into Friday's kind of like lower structure, and this Wednesday, Thursday highs, right? Which we can assume makes sense, right? With our Wednesday New York auction. Respecting the same area. Buyers really need to get up and through this and check this selling node, right? Is this an adequate selling node? Are there large participants with particularly U.S. banks that are interested in this area as sell side value? We need to check this, right? So for bulls after this test, like I said initially, another test is definitely acceptable here, but we want to see this whole structure from basically Wednesday's high, right, up through here cleaned and checked to really establish areas. That's why I have not labeled this as sell side value yet, because we don't know. So if we do get a retrace and test, I would not be surprised if we do see sellers quite present and quite active. Right now, then the question is, on any retrace, to continue to build more volume and time in this area, can we support above these Wednesday highs? Then ultimately with this Monday auction, right, it will be this Monday open. So around this 80 area, I think is safe. to kind of lean on. Obviously down through our 75s, a little 5-point range there. Obviously, it's not going to be perfect. We're still going to have to check order book and whatnot. But structurally, that's what I'm looking for. And if they can support above last week, we should see buyers step up. We want to see them step into the selling node and push us through into our first measured move target from last week. Now, if we flip over charts really quick, do I have levels on? Nope, but this might be messy. Regardless, we can see that we still have our daily ADRs building in this 30 to kind of like 20 area, as well as our average weekly range high. So this look above still makes sense for your weekly expansion, as well as this selling node, just based on measured moves, right? If we take last week's measured move, it does put us up towards 6,400. Now, this move I think would have to be quite squeezy. We'd have to see a pretty strong catalyst. Even today, right? We had a pretty strong tariff advancements come out today with some big numbers and did not cause a huge ripple, really, in comparison to what we've seen in the past. So to get the secondary expansion, I think would take a lot, but it is still our target. So, in conclusion, for buyers, the main thing is what happens through this Thursday, Friday structure. Can we get back in? Right? Can we accept in? Can we put pressure on the selling node from Friday? If yes, we want to see expansion off of a higher low retest. Right? Not too complex, but quite important with our holiday. Now, when we look through the sell side kind of pathing and structure, still lots of importance on this like 6190 to 6230 area, right, where we have not spent too much time. Big low volume here. We need to check validity of these buyers that we observed from 2 weeks ago on Friday that kind of built out this node. Any offer that drops down and can hold this zone, preferably this lower edge, but anywhere in this zone where we see sell side pressure drop down and into, should trigger secondary moves. Now, our previous all-time high, 61.66, right, from our 2024-2025 winter auction. We still saw interactions in our previous selling node, and if I do a big scroll here, right, here is our previous all-time high in this December, January test, and then February putting in the high before our big pull back. We can see the importance of this, right? Now, the question is, can sellers regain this action, right? If buyers are here, I know I said I'd talk about this at the end, but this is kind of going to be your neutral bearish. We'll get into it a little bit more, but we need to see offer hold zone, drop down, no buyers up and over previous all-time highs, and really hold the selling node as new sell-side value or returning sell-side value. Even getting down into that structure is going to be a big win for bears, right? But ultimately, we want to see a retest down into our primary previous balance. So 60-40 is a good spot to look. Now, do I think we can get too much under this? No, not without catalyst. Same idea for the secondary leg, right? This leg even into 60-40 and down into this like 6,000 area, I think would take a lot, right? If we remember our average ranges on ES, on average per week, we're doing like 100, 150 points generally. Where does that put us? Well, that would put us into the test of our previous high or up into our first extension target, right? So these areas make sense for just kind of your average directional kind of looks, right? With extension, I do believe needing to be catalyst driven for these secondary targets. Still, very poor structure here on any downside, so we can see pretty aggressive acceleration. I would expect it to, obviously this pathing is very rough, just showing kind of like primary areas, but if we get down, I wouldn't be surprised if something like this, and then a big squeeze up, and a big come down, and then a flush through, and a rebalance. Auctioning in these areas makes a lot of sense. So it's kind of what I'm looking for directionality. Before we get into anything neutral, does anyone have any questions on structure, how I kind of came to these conclusions, what I'm looking for, or what I'm looking at? See what you have. Cast typing. As he's typing, I will make one kind of comment. Clear to cast. Cool. A lot of this is like my confidence level is not super high, right? And we went over this quite a bit last week as to why, but I will reiterate it. We don't have the volume and we don't have the time, right? Until we can really build some areas out, I can only guess what should happen in these LVNs and where these areas are of interest based on our past structure. But my confidence leaning on them is quite low. My confidence is much higher once we start to see intraday action. We actually generate more market information. Um, so, am I? I'll take a step back. When we're viewing this and into these areas, those who have been around for a while uh, can hear me talk about some areas as like areas that we trade off of and areas that we trade to, right? Areas that we trade off of are generally areas we're really confident about seeing a reaction. Um, Versus an area we trade to is something where it makes sense as a target. It makes sense to see an interaction there, an auction take place that is generally counter trend to our trade. So, for example, for shorting, right? I'm interested in probably closing into this structure, but I'm not super confident in a long off of it. So that's an example of trading to instead of trading off of. And that's how I'm viewing a lot of the structure and a lot of these LVNs specifically, right? We should trade through the LVNs, but I have no way of knowing what the interaction or any level of super confident about reactionary trades through these levels. So very much treat them as trading two. Same idea to the high, right? The selling structure. If we get up and in, like through this, right? I'll clean this up. I know this is messy. But like this kind of mini auction here from our Globex last night, right? If we get up and in, do I expect we trade through? Yeah, right? That makes sense structurally. That makes sense based on value. But am I super comfortable taking a short here? No, right? I'm much more interested in taking off long pressure into here, and then if we return back through, taking that short. So a little more passive in entries and more aggressive in exits until we confirm, right? If people have questions on that, we can definitely address kind of more of that mentality or trading style around those things. Now, with the neutral option, which I think is probably our most probable for this week, we have two kind of areas. And if we look at last week, we can take kind of our last week's low, right, and last week's high. Um, Now, what do we notice? Well, the low is very much on this structure, right? We've talked about this a lot. If we see looks through today's low and into this upper edge and can support above last week's low, right? This is what I'm looking for, a neutral auction that is bullish in nature. That would print an inside candle where we don't break last week's low. But I would expect the offer to still maintain under this previous selling structure, right? So if we see an auction like this, what is that telling me? One, we have buy side value moving up, okay? But we don't see our sell side value being aggressive and really trying to shift. Okay, so this is going to confirm our buy side value, right? And show weakness of our sellers. So this is your more bullish. This would print an inside candle and set up a pretty nice setup for next week for any expansion into the highs or even a rejection at this highs to take out the lows. This would be my preferable auction for this week. Obviously, my language a lot last week and now this week is we need to spend some time. We need to get some volume back in. Even today was quite thin, right? I want to see kind of that return to normalcy on our order books, on our DOM, and really establish, can buyers hold this or do sellers want below? Now, same thing we talked about a little bit in the bearish, but what I would expect is if we don't see any buy side reaction here, we take out last week's low. For buyers to still be active kind of in this area and attempt to support, and to balance between these, right? This basically 6130 up through, 6200, give or take, this buying structure from our test back down 2 Fridays ago. Now, what does this tell us in terms of our value shift? Well, all of the buyers that put in effort up here were wrong, right? So we're seeing a clear shift of a buy side failure, right, with our sell side value dropping, right? Now, basically, what is this? Well, it's the opposite of what we are looking for in the bullish kind of neutral trading market. Why am I still calling this neutral? Well, we're not seeing a seller return to our previous value, right? So we're not really establishing or returning to structure where, well, let me rephrase that. We're not returning to structure we've traded before. We're still kind of in price discovery, right? Or more exact, value discovery. But we're seeing this strong failure from buyers and this more aggressive move from sellers. If this takes place, we take out the lows, I would put much more pressure on a return down into our lower structure before we can have a leg back up, or even if we can have a leg back up into what we observed last week. So kind of in big conclusion, right, for directional bias, we need to take out last week's high, or at least put pressure up here, and not see sellers hold this like 85 to 95 area, right? But preferably take out a high, continue to expand, especially off of holds of our most bullish last week's POC at 45, and down into kind of this 60 to 30 edge. For our bearish directionality, we really want to see us hold underneath our previous all-time high and reestablish this structure as sell side value. With our neutral markets, it's either are we holding above this zone or are we holding below this zone to kind of establish what direction we're leaning in terms of order book pressure and bias. All right. That was a decent bit. That was a pretty long market overview, especially after a holiday week and a slow week. But this is quite a telling time, specifically with the tariff news coming in. Obviously, when I do this, I generally spend some time on what our economic and earnings reports looks like for the week. And on reports, it is a big nothing burger. There is very little. We have FOMC minutes on Wednesday. Can cause some volatility, but shouldn't really cause directionality. Everything else is basically business as usual. No major reports. Earnings, nothing major. So a lot of it is White House pressure. And it's nice to see this structure with this type of reporting week, because it should give us that opportunity to see, can buyers push up, right? Or do they get tired, exhaust, and sellers take back over? So, a lot of words, a lot of time. I'll do my best to give good updates throughout the week. I know the newsletter this week, I took like the higher time frame view off, which we can just go quickly look at Russell. We are seeing acceptance into this upper node. I'll zoom it out a little bit, or actually zoom it in would probably be better to see. But we are holding into the structure. Same thing with buy side. Can we come up into this 2300? Nothing has changed. Can we support 2180? If we look back down, this is a major bearish failure. The inside week, right, very similar to what we looked for our kind of bullish neutrality on ES. So that is that.